We're going to start this course by looking at the history of how great thinkers have looked at consciousness and the conclusions they've come to based on the science of their time. Now, we're going to find a lot of these thinkers quite naive, and the issue is whether we ourselves are not just as naive in our way. So if we go back to the classical period of Greek thought, we find Plato saying that memory was like wax. Essentially, that he looked around and saw, well, what must memory be like in terms of the physical objects around me? And he saw that wax could actually hold impressions, so he said memory must be like wax. He also had a vastly more complicated theoretical structure, which was dualist, which contrasted a disincarnate mind from an incarnate body, and we're going to discuss that later in the context of Descartes. His student Aristotle was a different temperament. It is said that everybody by nature is drawn to either Plato or Aristotle. So Aristotle looked around and he said, for example, if we are sitting at a table, we have a visual impression of the table, we see it, we can feel it with the mechanical receptors in our skin, we can sometimes smell it. How is it that all of these impressions are held together? This is called the binding problem, and it has not really yet been solved in neuroscience. There are many interesting hypotheses. So the soul is what holds impressions together, but what holds the soul together? For Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body, and Aquinas adapted that later to say that man is rational by his soul. One irony of this is that the Catholic Church is ultimately oriented in a monist rather than dualist direction, and toward resurrection, not life after death. So Thomas Aquinas, who's the patron philosopher of Catholicism, says that the soul is actually intrinsically tied up in the body, that the rationality of humans, on which is based their superior nature, depends on this soul. So therefore there is no life after death. There's potentially resurrection through a cosmic process of reintegration of soul and body. In the 17th century, the French philosopher René Descartes again looked at this issue about consciousness. Now, he was in a room on his own in Ulm, and his issue was, well, how do I know that everything I think is not just a complete sham, a complete fraud put there by an evil spirit? So he looked for ineluctable, that is, undeniable grounds for knowledge, ultimately in his own consciousness. And he argued that logical errors could be made in everything, including geometry. Reason was therefore suspect, and this evil spirit could deceive him of everything. Eventually, the only certainty is that Descartes could construe himself to be something. So cogito ergo sum, I am thinking, therefore I am. Perhaps to placate the church authorities, who are, ironically are officially Aristotelians, Descartes placed the soul outside matter, which he called res extensa. So, ironically, Descartes was so concerned about heresy that he did something heretical. He placed the soul outside matter, and he downgraded matter, including biological matter, in that same move. And it's a move that in a lot of ways Western culture has suffered from. Sense impressions, Descartes argued, are served up to and processed by a homunculus, a little man, which interacts with the brain in the pineal gland. Now, within cognitive science, we've had a lot of problems with this. In particular, Descartes is on his own, and he's arguing that cognition occurs in this kind of vacuum, without other people around, without any particular task. We call this solipsism in people as in science. So cognitive science works on the basis that we are these kind of processors on our own. We call this methodological solipsism. The next thing is that the brain works almost independently of the world, in that it actually only functions with representations of the world. So we call this representationalism. And finally, there's a downplay of emotion and social factors. These are not really taken into account. And cognitive science, we argue, has suffered a lot from these Cartesian tenets. There still are people who actually abide by the Cartesian principles, and in particular, the great New Zealander John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on neuroscience, argued that we are in fact disincarnate souls in these kind of ways. Eccles used a lot of work in quantum mechanics to justify his viewpoint, and it's as well to say now that through quantum mechanics we can actually prove an awful lot of different things, many of which are contradictory with each other. So we're still at that state of our knowledge, and it's important to remember that. So he argued that self-conscious mind, as he called it, composed of these elements called psychons, interacts with the brain through probability fields, which were developed by a physicist called Henri Morgenot. Eccles, brilliant as he was not really sophisticated enough as a philosopher to consider issues about whether the homunculus had a homunculus within itself, the problem of infinite regress of the homunculus. Finally, in the Cartesian schema, we really have a difficulty with respect to how things can actually refer to the world, how concepts can refer to the world, and we call this the problem of grounding of symbols. We now come to the start of the British response to Descartes, which is John Locke, and we are similarly going to have a set of responses to British empiricism, which is the force within philosophy which Locke epitomizes. Locke debated with the Dutch philosopher Leibniz this issue. Does there exist a quasi-mathematical relationship between the shape of brain states and the felt experience of them? Leibniz believed yes and Locke no. Obviously, if there was such a relationship, our neuroscience and consciousness course would be very short, because we could quite simply point out the math that, look, you've got this circular brain state and so you feel a circle. This was reformulated in the 1990s as the hard problem by David Chalmers. We now come to the first respondent to Locke, who's the Irish philosopher George Berkeley, or Berkeley as he's pronounced in Britain and Ireland. According to Locke and Galileo, primary qualities like shape are external, secondary qualities like taste are internal. Berkeley responded that this is incoherent, and knowledge, being immaterial, cannot point beyond itself. Knowledge must be something sui generis, it must be in itself. It doesn't refer to anything, he argued. And this absolute idealism is irrefutable on philosophical grounds. So often within philosophy we come across a position that we can't actually refute. We may think it is wrong, we may think it is absurd, however, the rules of the game do not permit us to refute it. Berkeley continues on what was in fact the frame problem, and he argued that if we consider the multitude of different perspectives on a chair, as we wander around a chair, we get different perspectives all the time. What unifies them? So this is similar to the binding problem we saw earlier, and Berkeley's response, the soul, God, is what does this, therefore they exist. This does not suit everybody, to put it mildly. We now come to the opposite extreme within the philosophical movement we call British empiricism, and in this case it's the Scot David Hume. David Hume asked us to look within ourselves. We have this notion of a self that is full, and yet he argues that if we actually look at this thing called the self and we take its contents from it, it seems to disappear. Similarly, if we continue to try and examine ourselves in the way that, for example, Hindu mystics do, and we separate ourselves into subject and object, the regress is infinite. There eventually is no object to look at. So he argued that Berkeley's soul is not introspectively available and does not exist. He argued then that mind is a flux of ideas and sensations succeeding each other by similarity, contiguity, and contrast. When we think of cat, we think of dog, which is similar. When we think of the Eiffel Tower, we think of the Champs-Élysées, they're close to each other. And we think of contrast. When we think of black, we think of white. And he argued that the self, this soul, is no more than a bundle of sensations. So this is very hardcore materialism. And it is the opposite point of view to Berkeley, and this often happens within philosophy. We should note that within Eastern philosophy, within Vedanta in particular, this routine of Hume's is the search for the self, and this subject and object splitting they call nanyar, they call the question, who am I? And the idea is to purge oneself of all inauthentic contents until one becomes pure subjectivity. It has to be said that in this period of history, the Renaissance coming up to the Enlightenment, the certainty with which theories are asserted is striking. So, for example, Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, the common sense that judges sensations is in the forebrain. Now, common sense now has the resonance of horse sense or something like that. Back then, it referred to something more like the soul. And he argued that memory is at the back of the brain and fantasies in the middle. And dreams, he argued, occur by vapors from the stomach blocking the nerves. Again, all these statements are made in the 17th century quite categorically. It remains to be seen whether we, in 500 years' time, will look just as naive. Famously, from this same period, Descartes looked at the Tuileries robots, which were allowed to work by hydraulics. And he argued that perhaps humans are exactly the same. And let's remember, he has no notion of nerve action like we have at the moment. In conjunction with him, other French thinkers like Leca and other early moderns were producing hypotheses which were as specific as saying the shape of the cochlea determines which chords will be heard as transcendent in music. And again, we must ask the question, are we really any wiser? Now we come to Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, and he described himself as being shocked from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume. He was concerned to emphasize the unity of consciousness contra Hume against Hume's notion of this. And he argued, with respect to issues that Descartes had brought up, that there is a middle layer between mind and world. And this includes categories like quantity, which manifested themselves in schemas like number, and these gave links from subject to object. We have a continuation of this philosophical ancestry in moderns like Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and the current consciousness researchers like Chalmers, Dennett, and Alvey Noe that we're going to consider later.